Hi there, my Why Religion friends. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU Church History and Doctrine. Welcome to another great episode of the Why Religion podcast. In the October 2019 General Conference of the Church, President Russell M. Nelson spoke about poverty and other humanitarian concerns, saying this:
As members of the church, we feel a kinship to those who suffer in any way. As sons and daughters of God, we are all brothers and sisters. We heed an Old Testament admonition, "Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy."
President Nelson's linking of Old Testament law with modern social concerns highlights the continued relevancy of the Old Testament for confronting modern challenges, including challenges of poverty and the world's growing refugee crisis. Dr. George Pierce of BYU's Department of Ancient Scripture helped to edit the 2021 Sidney B. Sperry Symposium book titled Covenant of Compassion, Caring for the Marginalized and Disadvantaged in the Old Testament, including his own chapter called The Experience of Israelite Refugees. In this chapter, he details how King Hezekiah deliberately implemented certain initiatives to include displaced refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel as part of the southern kingdom of Judah.
And so, in all these ways, providing fortification, providing water and employment, incorporating them into the administration, having a Passover that would unify north and south, and naming his son Manasseh, he's worked to make them feel like they're part of the community. And for us, then, we can see that the lesson is to work to have people who are refugees in our midst.
Building off of his wife and colleagues' episode number 61 of the Why Religion podcast by Crystal Pierce, yes, George and Crystal Pierce are a husband and wife ancient scripture professor team. In this episode, Dr. George Pierce teaches us lessons from ancient covenant Israel for us in modern covenant Israel to care for the displaced and marginalized in our midst. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Ryan Sharp sat down with his colleague, Dr. George Pierce, to discuss Dr. Pierce's research chapter on the experience of Israelite refugees in the book Covenant of Compassion. In part one, Professor Pierce gives us a little background as an editor of the volume into the genesis of the project, why this theme was chosen, and his own chapter within it as he explores examples of Israelite refugees. In part two, he will discuss why this research matters, drawing on lessons from King Hezekiah. And in part three, he will tell us a little bit about why he chose to be a religious educator and to come to BYU and why he believes as a person of faith. So here's Professor Ryan Sharp with Professor George Pierce discussing his chapter on Israelite refugees.
We are here to talk with you about a recent publication that you have. The title of the volume is Covenant of Compassion, Caring for the Marginalized and Disadvantaged in the Old Testament. Can you give us an overview of the volume and maybe share with us how the committee landed on this important topic?
Overview of the volume is one of illustrating the sort of command or covenants in the Old Testament that require ancient Israel and Judah, and by extension us, to care for the marginalized in society. As we look at the Old Testament, it's clear there are several categories that both the law and the prophets point out, and that is the widow, the orphan, the poor, and what the King James Version translates as the stranger in the Old Testament. The word for stranger is actually refugees. And so widows, poor, orphans, and refugees are those on the margins of society who should be taken care of. And so this volume really concentrates and brings together some of these elements. There's a couple chapters on vision and right, disability studies. There are a couple chapters on women and motherhood as not being the sort of like center of attention within the Old Testament. I have a chapter on refugees. My wife, Dr. Crystal Pierce, has a chapter on refugees. And there are a couple others as well. So that's the sort of overview, is looking at these sort of marginalized components of Israelite society. The volume and the subject as a whole came about actually in an interesting way. I was brought onto the committee later on after I sort of returned in refugee-like status from Jerusalem because of COVID. But as I was consulting with my colleagues, it came about in the sense that as they were thinking about the various topics, Avram Shannon talked to his wife, Thora, about it. And as they were in the middle of their conversations, it was actually Thora who suggested, why don't you guys talk about some of the marginalized portions of Israelite society? And this would then create an opportunity to have Sister Eubank come and talk, given her work with LDS Philanthropies and of course, as a member of the Relief Society presidency overall. So that's kind of the sort of genesis of it as I understood. So when I showed up, basically then it was a task to assess the papers, to look at what had been proffered for us, and then to see which ones we could accept for publication and for presentation.
Very good. Thank you. Now let's transition to your chapter. In the introduction, you write, statistics from the United Nations Refugee Agency show that at the end of 2019, 79.5 million individuals have been forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violation. Thus, while public attention often shifts to other concerns such as pandemics, politics, or economics, the refugee situation is persistent, requiring attention. Refugees have a prominent, although sometimes overlooked, place in biblical and restoration scripture and in the history of the church. So against that backdrop, I'd love to hear what motivated your particular study and any other introductory comments you want to make about your chapter.
I think it's as an archaeologist who works in Israel and as a student of the ancient Near East, my attention is usually drawn to that sort of section of the world. And in the past, 5-10 years or more, with the Syrian civil war and with other conflicts and such and persecution as we've listed here in this chapter, really the attention in the modern era as to these people's plight and countries in Europe accepting them or not accepting them or having qualifications about it, and then furthermore refugees coming to the United States, whether it's from Syria or more recently Afghanistan or any other country, it sort of piques my attention as I think about how this works and correlates with the ancient populations and the upheavals that they did. So it's kind of my interest in that and how that works. And of course, even before this, my wife and I were involved with getting together hygiene kits and those kind of materials for an organization called Lifting Hands International, and they would send these hygiene kits to the country of Jordan, where a lot of these Syrian refugees had come, and so that was the sort of like background to it. I think even now, currently, as we're sitting here right now discussing this, we're looking at a situation where the UN has estimated that 1 million or more Ukrainian refugees are seeking places in Europe because of the conflict with Russia. And so the refugee situation isn't going away. Just in the past year, we've welcomed, even here in Utah, refugees from Afghanistan to resettle. And now we have a Ukrainian situation as well, just to add to all of it. And so it's always there. It's always prevalent. And so I always, like I said, I always like to think, well, how does this work anciently? And are there some lessons we can learn here? And so that's what then drew me to this sort of paper and the study about Israelite refugees.
Yeah, and with that, in fact, I want to share one of your stated purposes of the paper where you write, this paper attempts to show the relevant practical applications that may arise from supplementing Scripture with archaeology and what lessons for interacting with and assisting the disenfranchised and marginalized within society may be gleaned from both the archaeological and biblical records. So while we'll move toward application in our next section of the interview,
Sure.
I would just invite our listeners to pay attention as you walk us through some of the biblical and archaeological references, because I do think we find some beautiful parallels, and I think it would be helpful to kind of keep an ear open for those as we go through. So in the next section of your chapter, you introduce readers to refugees in the biblical text. Talk us through some of the examples that you identified in this study.
Sure, absolutely. Refugees have an interesting status in the biblical text because, as I mentioned before, the King James translates the word as strangers, and it should be refugees. And the acknowledgement that they exist and they are within society is prevalent throughout the Old Testament. But we have the Old Testament characters themselves in a very real way being refugees. So when we think about even the stories of the ancestors of Israel, and by ancestors I mean the patriarchs and matriarchs, so Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel and their children and all, we can see that even within their lifetimes, they have the refugee experience. And so when there's periods of drought in Canaan, Abraham goes to Egypt as a refugee and finds refuge there. When the big sort of drought during the time of Joseph hits, then Joseph is able to bring Jacob, his father, and the rest of the family down into Egypt to again find refuge as refugees. The Exodus tradition, the Israelites see themselves both in the moment and then later on in the Old Testament, they see themselves as refugees from that situation. In fact, they're commanded to not despise or mistreat refugees because they were once refugees themselves. And so there's this connection then that Israel should have with those who are on the margin because they used to be there. But as we look further on, we can think about like the book of Ruth. So Ruth herself coming back from Moab into Judah with her mother-in-law Naomi, they're refugees. David and his men who are disenfranchised when they're on the run for Saul are refugees. There's other examples. Elijah the prophet is a refugee. Jeremiah talks about Judahite refugees over across the Jordan there. And as we look at other books of Scripture as well, the Book of Mormon is full of it. I mean, Lehi and his family start off as refugees leaving Jerusalem. Now, it's not in the moment of attack. It's not all kind of a dire moment, but it's what we call an anticipatory movement. Lehi is given the word that something's going to happen. He needs to take his family out into the wilderness and to go, and they do that. But we see throughout the Book of Mormon, there's periods where the Nephites need to leave because of Lamanite oppression, right? And so they're refugees. Or most notably, and my wife, Dr. Crystal Pierce, has written on this, the people of Ammon, the anti-Nephi Lehis, they're refugees, and they are accepted into Nephite society. And so we have all that. And if that isn't enough for us, then the crown jewel, I would say, of refugees is the fact that Jesus himself, as a child with Joseph and Mary, are refugees, and they leave the persecution of Herod there in Judea and go to Egypt for a time and then come back out. So paralleling that Exodus type of tradition and experience. So biblically, right, within the text, we have all of these strong examples that we can say, okay, that works. We may not think of it that way, but once we start to see it, we're like, oh yeah, no, it's all over the place. And as I said before, the prophets are all about making sure that the people sort of understand the need to care for refugees. So the archaeological situation is a little bit different. It's kind of interesting because the situation that I've set up here in this chapter talking about the 8th century BC, we don't get any mention of it in Scripture. But archaeologically, there's some pretty strong evidences of refugees in the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel.
And this is exactly where I was wanting to go as we look at some of these biblical examples, as well as other scriptural examples. And obviously, you mentioned in the chapter within the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a similar narrative. But I do want to shift to that archaeological approach because I found this fascinating. And obviously, there is way more in this section than we have time to talk about today. So maybe just introduce our listeners to some of your findings and what they show us archaeologically about these ancient refugees.
Let me contextualize this in two ways. First of all, historically, we're looking at a period in the 8th century BC, somewhere around 730, maybe a little bit after that. But it's about the time that we would think of scripturally as Isaiah 7, Isaiah chapter 8, if we're familiar with that, and the parallels in 2nd Nephi that are there. And we have this situation in which the northern kingdom of Israel had been a vassal to the biggest military imperial threat that the Bible had seen to date, and that was Assyria. Assyria is a kingdom located in northern Mesopotamia, so now Iraq and southern part of Turkey, but they expand across the Near East into the regions nowadays we would call Syria and Jordan, and into Israel and Lebanon.
So are they, let me jump in with a quick
Sure.
kind of follow-up. Are they the most powerful simply because of size and numbers, or is there something else to that?
They're the most powerful because they, at that time, were the most efficient. They were able to muster the largest armies against their opponents, and they were also successful in what they were doing. And they were able to then absorb into their empire and incorporate these areas that they were conquering. And so this is why they're part of the most powerful that are there. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel has been a vassal to them, so they pay them tribute to stay away, and everyone plays on nice terms. But toward the end of that, as we see in the middle of the 8th century, Israel decides that they don't want to be a vassal anymore. And they ally with another kingdom to the north, and this is all in Isaiah chapter 7, the kingdom of Damascus. And they want the kingdom of Judah to join with them because there's strength in numbers, right? So the king of Judah refuses that.
And this is Ahaz?
This is Ahaz, the king of Judah. He refuses that. And so then Israel and Damascus decide, well, let's just go ahead and conquer Judah, and then we'll take care of Assyria later on. Now, this is where Isaiah steps in. And as we see in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8, Isaiah's prophetic word is to trust in the Lord. Don't worry about politics. Don't worry about military strength. Don't worry about anything else. You trust in the Lord, and the Lord's going to take care of this. We all know the story because Ahaz doesn't trust in the Lord. And Ahaz then turns to Assyria because his logic is if Assyria can come and put pressure on them from the north, then they'll leave him alone. So Ahaz then becomes a vassal of Assyria against Isaiah's word, against the word of the Lord. And we have the situation then that Assyria then starts to campaign, first against Damascus, and they conquer Damascus and they absorb it into the empire. And then in 732 BC, the Assyrian king comes and campaigns against Israel, and he conquers the Galilee. So all those Israelite tribes that are living up there, they get conquered, and they get deported from their land to other places in the Assyrian Empire. Eventually then, the Assyrians come and they conquer the capital of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and they deport the rest of the northern kingdom to someplace else in the Assyrian Empire. Now, what this situation does is it creates refugees because people know that Assyria is coming. It's not like it's a secret. They don't just show up one day and like, oh, there's Assyrians outside my door. They know that it's coming. Those that can, much like Lehi and his family, in advance, they will move. The logical place they're going to move is they're going to move south. They're going to move south to Judah. Why? Because there's already these connections between Israel and Judah, and there's a sort of shared background and all the rest of this. Those that can't will usually either flee to the countryside, or when the Assyrians show up, that's when they'll flee, and they also then flee to Judah.
And when you say those who can, you mean financially, economically, or?
Those who can financially or sort of status-wise, because they can afford to. They can afford to leave things and go. Usually the people who can't move, and this is what we see with the current situation, Syria, Ukraine, et cetera, is that those who can't afford, it's kind of in the moment, they just need to flee from the conflict. And so they don't have the luxury of going to Poland or Romania or somewhere else. And they just have to sort of flee as they can. So same situation here. We have a couple of movements of Israelites who are coming south into Judah. What that does then is it swells the population of Judah. And we see in the countryside, some new sites start to spring up, but mostly in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is going to go, by any estimates, from a town, a city of a couple thousand people to tens of thousands of people within a decade or less. And so we have this situation. So historically, that's one thing that's going on. The other thing that we have going on archaeologically throughout the 19th and 20th centuries was kind of a question of how large was Jerusalem? Where did the people live, and what was going on here? And it's fairly clear from the middle of the 19th century that that one portion of Jerusalem that was settled fairly early and consistently was a portion known as the Eastern Hill. This is part of the Temple Mount, we call the Temple Mount today, and then there's a saddle and then another hill, and then we call that the City of David. This seems to be the earliest part. This is the part that David conquers from the Canaanites. This is the part where Solomon's temple is and everybody's going to live. And as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli archaeologists were able then to start digging in the Old City. And they were digging in an area which is known as the Western Hill, right? So it sits opposite of the Eastern Hill. And what they found then was that the Western Hill was unoccupied until somewhere in the mid to late 8th century. And all of a sudden, they started to see houses. And, okay, here's some houses. They date to this period. There's some pottery. There's some other installations going on here. Nothing seems to be planned, but they started to see that there was a growth. And Jerusalem continued to grow as they examined the finds and they looked at this. But it was interesting that it didn't happen until the 8th century. So this got archaeologists thinking, why the growth? And as they looked at the Bible and they looked at history, it was kind of clear that these people seem to have been refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel. Right now, interestingly enough, we don't just have to rely on a theory to say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What we get in these excavations are several sort of indicators. There are a couple indicators from pottery and other material culture that kind of have links to a northern style, but what we really get is names. Names that only really appear in northern contexts. And so there are a couple seals that people use to sort of sign their name, if you will, back in the ancient day. And one of them has the name of Menachem. And Menachem is only known in the Bible from a northern context. Right? We don't see anybody from the south, from Judah, with the name Menachem. There's another phrase on a portion of pottery that somebody wrote that talks about the name Mikiyahu, which is fine. That seems southern. But the phrase that's also on it is this phrase in Hebrew. It says El Kone Aretz. It means God, creator of the earth. And it seems to be more of a northern use of that phrase. More recently, we also have excavations from the City of David that also bear other pottery pieces that have writing on them. And there's a name, Ahiav, son of Menachem. And Ahiav is interesting because, well, we hear it and go, okay. It gets shortened to Ahab. And if you know anything about the Old Testament and Old Testament history, there's only one Ahab, and he's a king of the north, in the northern kingdom of Israel in 1 Kings. And so these names, and there's another one, this guy's name is Buki, and he's probably connected with the tribe of Dan on some level. So we have these northern names that start to show up in the archaeology. So, right, it's no longer just a theory or, well, these things kind of look like, northern pottery or other material culture. Now we have names and we can say, okay, these are definitely sort of names. We don't have these names pop up anywhere else in the South. So it seems like the refugees, right, from the kingdom of Israel. And that's kind of, I don't know, interesting to me because we can start to put the pieces together and say, well, this particular instance isn't mentioned in Scripture of those from the north coming into the south. What we do see archaeologically is the fact that these Israelites do come south, looking for some kind of refuge, looking for a place to live, and their number one pick is going to be the capital city, and that's going to be Jerusalem. And this is going to lead to other things as we think about this, just a connection with the Book of Mormon. Lehi and his family are descendants from Manasseh, as I recall. And it is likely then that Lehi's ancestors probably came south from the north sometime during this period between 740 and 720. So about, 120 years or so or more before, right, we start the Book of Mormon. And so we kind of have all these kind of clues going together in terms of the presence of Israelite refugees. And so whereas Jerusalem starts off on the eastern hill with the Temple Mount and the city of David. By the time we get to about 720 or so, Jerusalem has now expanded to the western hill across from there, and you have all these people, most of whom are refugees, living right on that hill. And the king at the time, King Hezekiah, Ahaz's successor, is going to do his best to try and integrate them into society. And I think that's where we can get some lessons.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place for you to check out. I want to alert you to a new book by the RSC called Restorations, Scholars in Dialogue from Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by Andrew Bolton and Why Religion's own Casey Griffiths from the Department of Church History and Doctrine. This book contains reflections from two groups of scholars who trace their beginnings to the early saints who built the Kirtland Temple. These scholars come from the two largest branches of the Restoration movement, Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have often found themselves on the opposite sides of many issues. This book is filled with honest, frank conversations between people of the two faiths, but also collegiality and friendship. Centering on 12 themes, this dialogue is about bringing together informed scholars from the two churches working together with goodwill to accurately understand one another. Again, the book is called Restorations, Scholars in Dialogue from Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to George Pierce from BYU Ancient Scripture discuss his research chapter on Israelite refugees in the Old Testament. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to explore a little bit more why this research matters. How can it inform and help us in living, learning, or loving aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? In this part, Professor Pierce discusses what archaeology reveals about Hezekiah's efforts to include Israelite refugees in the Kingdom of Judah, and what we can learn from that effort today.
We spent a lot of time talking about refugees in antiquity, what it looked like in 8th century Judah. In your final section, you outlined some important lessons from biblical archaeology and kind of in general of the plight of refugees. And I want to maybe just share a couple of statements from your conclusion and then give you an opportunity to take it any direction you want. You write, the main lesson that the experience of the Israelite refugees teaches is the importance of unity to avoid marginalization and community disarticulation. As part of the family of God, we should strive to include those who have lost their connection to a homeland, employment, or family. Talents should be recognized and encouraged to better the community of God and further the work of the kingdom. Most importantly, respect and inclusion may rebuild familial bonds that are weakened or severed. So with that, what are some of the major lessons that you see kind of under that umbrella from this study that may have both relevance anciently as well as application for us?
Okay. Well, I think in general, as we look at this and we think about this, what's written there, I think, and I hate to sort of brag on my own writing, but
it was amazing. I feel like you should.
No, well, it's one of these things where this is truly the lesson. Part of what refugees face is the fact that there's this disunity or sort of disjunct with their homeland, and it puts strains on family relationships, and there's all this sort of danger of being marginalized. So the situation that we get with all these Israelite refugees coming into Judah is that King Hezekiah is faced with, how then do we deal with these refugees? The easy way would be, well, just let them fend for themselves and that's that. But that's not what he does. Hezekiah, because he's planning a revolt of his own against Assyria, has certain plans, and he's able to draw on these Israelite refugees. One of the things that he does is he builds fortifications around Jerusalem, and I talk about this in the article. It's this section that was found in the Jewish quarter in the Old City called the Broad Wall. And it's called the Broad Wall because it's like 4.5 meters or so wide, so about 12 to 15 feet wide. and it stood right very high. What we have is just the foundation, but it's a gigantic wall. And he fortifies Jerusalem, not just the Eastern Hill, not just the Temple Mount and the Palace Precinct, but all of Jerusalem. So he's trying to incorporate and encapsulate everywhere where people are living in Jerusalem, including where the refugees are living. So that's one way he's trying to be inclusive. I mentioned before that there was a piece of pottery with the name Ahiav, son of Menahem, that was found in the city of David. This was actually found in a context, and it seems like this person, Ahiav, who seems to be clearly Northern Israelite roots, is brought into and incorporated into the administration. So those that are more financially stable, who could flee ahead of the Assyrians and are probably better educated and come from a better socioeconomic status to begin with, Hezekiah starts to incorporate these people into his own administration and using them for their talents, and being able to recognize those things. Hezekiah also realizes that there's only one water source for Jerusalem. It's the Gihon Spring, and it's on the eastern side of the Eastern Hill. So what about all the people on the Western Hill? Where are they going to get water? Hezekiah knows that the Assyrians will probably come and besiege the city, so he needs to do something about the water source. What he does then is commission what is still considered an engineering marvel, and he commissions a tunnel. And starting at two opposite ends, one team starting at the spring on the Eastern Hill and one team starting where the pool would be between the two hills, they start cutting toward each other. And it's an interesting story. And we have the inscription because when they got done, they carved it. And then the story goes along the lines of these two teams are cutting towards each other. And as they start getting closer, you can actually hear the people of the other team with their picks on the stone. And then it's this race, right, to see who can meet up with each other. And it says eventually they're going and they're pick against pick. And then all of a sudden the sort of tunnel is created and the breach is made and the water's flowing from the spring down to the pool and everybody rejoices. Now they carve this sort of recounting of the cutting of the tunnel into the wall close to where the two teams meet. Interestingly enough, two scholars, one of whom I had as a professor at UCLA, did some examination of the language, and the language is actually written. It seems to be written in a northern dialect of Hebrew, so a dialect that would have been spoken in Israel and not so much in Judah. What this shows me is Hezekiah is smart in a few ways. Number one, he knows he needs to fortify all the refugees and include them as part of the Jerusalem family, if you will. He incorporates those who have the talents and the knowledge of administration into his own to be able to probably work with those refugee populations. Thirdly, he puts the refugee population to work and gives them something whereby everyone would benefit. And that's the cutting of what we now call Hezekiah's tunnel. And you can, if you go to Jerusalem today, you can go through it. It's a really great experience to sort of think about this. What we see then is Hezekiah working his best to incorporate northern Israelites who at one time were from a completely different kingdom and considered to be enemies of Judah. Now, because they have this shared background religiously and culturally, they're part of the family. Hezekiah also does two other things. Number one, he, according to the chronicler, he wants to have a Passover. So he sends out messengers, not just throughout Judah, but also into lands that have been conquered by Assyria. So there's my argument against Assyria being concerned about it. He sends messengers into former territory of the northern kingdom of Israel, into the tribal territories, to call everybody who's left over to come observe Passover together. Which, if there's anything that's fundamental to the Jewish identity, even modernly, it's the idea of celebrating Passover, because they all have that Exodus tradition, right, in common. So he tries to accomplish this. Some people from the northern tribes who are left over in the land do come down, so it's moderate success. The other thing that he does, interestingly, is he names his son and successor that we see in the Bible. He names his son Manasseh. It's the only instance we have of a king being named after a tribal ancestor, if that makes sense. And so in all these ways, providing fortification, providing water and employment, incorporating them into the administration, having a Passover that would unify right, north and south, and naming his son Manasseh, he's worked to make them feel like they're part of the community. And for us then, we can see that the lesson is to work to have people who are refugees in our midst. Now, maybe I live in Vineyard. Maybe I don't have refugees living next to me in Vineyard. But within Utah, right, and within the United States in general and other Western countries, we have refugees. We should follow the biblical example of not marginalizing them, but including them in the community, recognizing them for their talents, providing them an opportunity to be able to help and to increase their sense of self-worth, and hopefully then, right, provide these bonds that will bridge cultures, families, right, and sometimes religions to be able to work together. And I think that that's probably the main lesson here.
One more specific question about the chapter, and then we'll shift gears to our final segment. I'm curious for you. It's clear from this discussion you feel strongly about this. I'm curious what this project, how has it influenced you as you did this study and wrote this chapter?
I think on a personal level, I have always been aware of refugees and sort of thinking about this, especially in the last, right, like I said, decade or so or more with the Syrian crisis. But it's made me want to actually put action to my beliefs and to my thoughts, and I've done that in two ways. Number one, as I mentioned before, putting together hygiene kits, being able to get them to the right people who will send them overseas to Jordan or Lebanon or wherever else. And so it's made me want to, right, like I said, put legs on this and let's do this. Secondly, it's encouraged me in my classes here at BYU to include a service component. And part of the aims of BYU education includes this whole sort of leading to lifelong service element to it. And the more I started thinking about this, both in my Old Testament classes and in my New Testament classes and Book of Mormon, everything I teach, but mostly I teach Old Testament, New Testament, I thought maybe we should have some service elements. And so I tried it out one semester, and I put on there that part of their requirement for the class was to go do service. Now, I didn't really structure it as well as I probably could have for the first time around, but the results were incredible because the students started to do service, and I would read their reports, and there's a lot of them that were like, oh yeah, no, I loved it, and it was great, and I helped out in a soup kitchen, or I helped with reading and tutoring, elementary or middle school children. I had a student who spent 60 hours knitting caps for infants in the NICU. So it's mind-blowing. And students who don't feel comfortable going out and doing those things, I encourage them to do things like billiongraves.com or Ancestry or even just indexing names. And the responses I got were really, really stirring in the fact that there were the normal, this is great, I loved it, and it was wonderful. But there were those who were just completely honest with me, and it was like, I didn't want to do this going into it. And I was, I'd read on, seeing how the paper would go. And there's always the but. I didn't want to do this going into it. I don't like doing this. I don't like putting myself out there. And then there's, but once I started doing it, I could see, right, how I was helping out, and I could see how I was making a difference. And so personally, I've had to put legs on my own, sort of, right, put my money where my mouth is, to sort of use that phrase. But then also in classes now, for the past 2 years, I've had this service element as part of my syllabus and part of my classes. If you're going to be part of this Dr. Pierce's classes, then you're going to do service. And the number of hours that we've had put in and the amount of blessings that we've seen and just changed lives, not only from those being served, but those serving, has made all the difference. And I think it's something I'm not ever going to take away from my syllabi from here on out. They have to serve. And specifically about refugees, we were able to raise a couple $100 just from student donations. I don't solicit, I don't make them do it. If they want to, then I'll go buy the stuff. They can assemble the kits and we'll get them sent out. So a couple $100 worth of hygiene kits, which, that's quite a few that can go help people.
If you're interested in reading the book Covenant of Compassion and George Pierce's specific chapter on the experience of Israelite refugees, we've provided a link to the book on our website at yreligion.byu.edu. That's the letter yreligion.byu.edu. There, we've also given you a link to learn more about Professor George Pierce and his other research publications. While I'm at it in this transition, please also remember to give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast if you want to comment on episodes and be part of the Why Religion social media community. And last, as always, we appreciate all those who share this podcast and spread it with friends and family of those who you think may benefit from the research of BYU religion professors. We just passed our 1 millionth global download of the podcast, so we're grateful for you for helping spread the good of this podcast. All right, we've arrived at our last segment of Why Religion, Part 3, where we like to get a little bit more personal and discuss things with the professor, such as where he or she got their degree, what brought them to BYU, and why they are a person of faith. So here is George Pierce discussing some of those questions.
I want to shift now to our final segment where we get to talk about you, my friend. So first of all, maybe talk to us about your training. Where did you study? Why did you decide to do that? Kind of walk us through your educational journey.
So my undergraduate degree is in history, modern history. I wrote about actually international politics pre-World War I for my thesis when I was in undergrad, with a minor in biblical studies. I went to a Christian school, Clearwater Christian College, and everyone minors in biblical studies, so that's good. During the process of that, I did have one course in biblical archaeology as an elective, and I thought it was interesting. Afterward, I went to work in the retail sector, and after a while, I just felt that something was missing, so I needed to go back to school. And I thought about what I wanted to do, and I realized that computers were the way to go. And so I needed something that worked with computers and a history or something. And it just happened that I walked into the living room one day and my dad was watching a program on TV about the Theban mapping project in Egypt and how they were digitally recording the tombs of the kings. And I was like, that's what I want to do. And so, funnily enough, so I emailed them and I got their computer guy, go figure, who answers the emails back then. And he said that I need to do a few things, learn French, learn German, learn to and accept to be poor the rest of my life, that kind of thing.
How's all of that going?
So? Yeah, they're good. So no, I'm just kidding. Yeah. And anyway, the advice was go get trained, right? Go get trained. And so I looked for a program that was Christian, but sound academically in biblical archaeology. And I landed on Wheaton College. And I landed on Wheaton College right about the time of the Second Intifada in Israel, the popular uprising back in the early 2000s. And so they weren't able to send people to Israel because of Intifada. So they couldn't give me a degree in biblical archaeology, but they went with biblical studies. And I took all the same classes that the biblical archaeology people got, except I didn't spend a semester in Jerusalem, but that was fine. Along the way, I needed some more digital training, so I went to the University of York in England and got a master's degree in archaeological information systems. And then went back to Wheaton to finish my MA in biblical studies. And about that time, I saw an email regarding a fellowship, and one of the places that you could go on this fellowship was to Israel. And so I ended up as a research faculty member at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel. And I spent some time there. And after that, or as that was coming to a close, I figured I needed to do a PhD. And so I applied to various schools, and UCLA was my choice, and ended up at UCLA and earned my PhD there in Near Eastern languages and cultures. And the emphasis is in archaeology of the Southern Levant, so Israel and Jordan.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So take us from there then to BYU religious education.
Yeah. Contrary to other experiences, I did not have an angel visit my bedchamber, nor was told on high from with a flaming scroll that I would be a religious educator.
Have you read my story?
That's exactly.
Yeah.
No, I knew exactly that
Yeah.
was your story, and the whole thing. So my then wife, Crystal, and I were writing our dissertations at the same time. We met in the department at UCLA in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and we were actually on a fellowship in Jerusalem writing our dissertations. And we'd had some contact with BYU faculty before. Crystal knew Carrie Muhlstein and from a long time back. I probably shouldn't say a long time, from a short time back. And we had met, we'd also met Ken Jackson and Frank Judd, and I knew Jeff Chadwick from conferences. And so we were no strangers, and of course, church members. So we were attending the Jerusalem branch and living in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, writing our dissertations. And we spoke in sacrament. And afterward, Frank Judd came to us and asked, "Have you guys ever considered teaching in religious education?" And I was like, "No, Frank, I haven't." Hasn't really even crossed my mind. And he said, "Maybe you should think about it. It's totally different from what you're doing your dissertations on. You're not probably going to be teaching archaeology straight out of the gate, but consider it and think about this." So I said, "Okay, we'll see." We came home halfway through that year around Christmas time, and we had a meeting with Camille Olson and with Carrie Muhlstein and talked about it and said, "Okay, we'll think about this," and everything else. And then things started to develop, and they contacted us and said, "Why don't you guys teach?" And so summer of 2013, we ended up coming back from Israel, packing up our apartment in Los Angeles in about 2 weeks' time, and moving to Utah. And I started teaching here June of 2013 and sort of fell into it. So that's my story of how I came to BYU. There are other significant elements, like I converted to the church while I was in UCLA. That's probably one of the most significant elements to the whole thing. In 2009. And so when I started teaching here, I'd only been a member of the church 4 years. And here I am at BYU teaching Book of Mormon to returned missionaries. So my joke with all that is that before I got baptized, I had read up through about Helaman 11 or so. I hadn't even got to the good part of the Book of Mormon before I got baptized.
Careful.
No, it's all good. No, I hadn't even got to what I consider to be, it's 3 Nephi 11. It's the pivotal moment when Jesus appears to the Nephites. I hadn't even gotten there when I got baptized. But I assured my first classes that I had read the rest of the Book of Mormon after I got baptized, so we could do that. But it was through the efforts of a lot of people, Frank Judd, Kent Jackson, Carrie Muhlstein, and others who are still colleagues here, who advocated for me to work here and to bring what I bring to the table to the students. And so I'm thankful to them, right? And of course, thankful to Crystal for her witness to aid my conversion, and ever grateful to the witness of the Holy Ghost. And so here I am.
Awesome. I want to ask one more follow-up question, kind of in that same spirit. What is it that helps you believe? What roots you in the restoration?
I think what roots me in the restoration as an archaeologist and someone who studies the past is being able to read the text, but then connect with the text in a very real way. And I'll answer it in this sort of way. A lot of that depends on my actual physical senses. So, for instance, I can read about the history of the church, and I can read about Joseph's experiences, and I can read the Doctrine and Covenants and all the rest of this. And then when we went to Nauvoo, and I could poke around in the basement of the red brick store with the archaeologists who had been working there, I could touch Joseph's things, right? The things that were left behind and the things they found in Samuel H. Smith and Hiram's stuff and Sidney Rigdon and all the rest of it. And it connected me in a very real way and said, this is real, right? And these guys were real and they experienced things. When I go to Israel, I can handle things and see things that the Israelites and the Judahites and their successors later on, right, during the Roman period, the Jews or the Romans or whatever handled. And that connects me in a very real way. When I have the absence of that sort of evidence, like for the Book of Mormon, because we don't have a spot, right, we don't have artifacts, I'm still led to look at this and say, these are real people, right, with real concerns, with real stories, dealing with real issues and real spiritual journeys. And I'm glad that they're real in a very real way that sometimes I can touch and sometimes I just have to go on faith. And there are places in Israel that I go to, and even though there's no physical trace of him, I can still stand there and say, I can feel the presence of Christ. I can feel that he was here. And maybe you can relate to this. I always say that spiritual events leave an impression on the physical world. And so when I go to Israel and I go to some of these places, I can feel the imprint. And it's the same sort of imprint that we get, or that at least I get, when you walk into the Kirtland Temple. Without any physical trace, you know that something happened there spiritually that impacted that place. And you could sit there in the Kirtland Temple and look at those pulpits and say, Jesus himself appeared there. So one of the things that helps to ground my beliefs then is that there are things I can very much tangibly handle and say these people are real. They're not just characters. If they were characters, man, let's just read Lord of the Rings and like have a great day with this, right? But it's more than that, right? They're real people. And when I don't have that, I can still feel that imprint to the witness of the Spirit. Right? The Spirit's telling me maybe not the veracity of the place. This is the actual place where Jesus stood. But it's giving me witness that Jesus himself is real and his message is real. Right? And that's something that we carry on to everyone else.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, Ryan Sharp, and Hank Smith. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Mitchell Bashford. Say hi, Mitchell.
Hey, guys.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.